Young Earth Creationism is precluded entirely by dozens upon dozens of well-known facts of the natural world, from the Radioactive Decay Law, the speed of light, and the nature of the geologic column, to the statistics that surround common ancestry, the fossil record, and our genetic relationship to the rest of the primates, mammals, and really just the entire tree of life. But so frequently I encounter what I am calling bite-sized busts, aspects of STEM fields that entirely preclude young Earth creationism that aren't typically talked about, but bust hard nevertheless. Be it geology, anthropology, astronomy, or physics, here we discuss the minutia of fields that leave young Earth creationism out in the cold. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe if you like this kind of content, leave a like and maybe a comment, and if you feel like supporting the channel in other ways, you can check out my Patreon, my PayPal, or stores. Today we are discussing the nature of polystrate fossils, a common geologic phenomena that is exploited by creationists in order to support a global flood, and we will find that they do no such thing. In fact, you might even say that they preclude young Earth creationism.
Hey, old man, give me everything.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
Polystrate fossils are fossils that pass through more than one geologic stratum. In geology, these fossils are referred to as upright fossils or T0 assemblies, meaning the term polystrate appears to be of creationist origin. We will continue to use their terminology for the purposes of clarity, given this is a busting of young Earth creationism. Now, as previously mentioned, creationists love polystrate fossils.
And so polystrate fossils are a good way of saying if a tree, for example, extends through multiple layers, how could it have sat there while thousands of years are allegedly taking place, slowly burying it inch by inch? Wouldn't the top rot and fall away, and so forth? So it's an argument in favor of a young Earth as opposed to millions of years.
Exactly, and the secularists and the mainstream scientists prefer to just call them upright fossils, which I think does describe their orientation.
But wait, how could a tree remain upright for millions of years while sediment slowly builds up around the trunk, preserving it from decay? There is only one way to explain what is seen at this site and other similar sites all around the world: catastrophism. Even most atheistic geologists will admit that this has to be the case.
Now, normally what we do here is we go through the conventional explanation for something first, and then we discuss why it's problematic for creationists. But today we're actually going to do the reverse. We're going to explore why creationists love utilizing these particular finds, and then we're going to delve into their true nature. As we all know, young Earth creationism requires a spontaneous creation event some 6,000 years ago, as well as a global flood event some 4,400 years ago that is responsible for all layers of the geologic column from the Cambrian to the Cretaceous, as well as their fossils, every impact event or mass extinction signature within said layers, the current positioning of the continents, the state of decay of all radioactive elements, and finally, the various levels of diversity for all extant life. To a creationist, polystrate fossils provide this definitive evidence that all of the layers of the geologic column were deposited one by one during the single half-year period of a global flood. They will exploit standard deposition rates in geology, which commonly take thousands to millions of years for substantial accumulation, and argue that since the fossil, in this case a lycopod trunk, spans multiple layers, that the layers could not have been deposited slowly like conventional science says. Otherwise, they argue, the trunk would have rotted away or decomposed. Creationists also know that these fossils cannot, if their worldview is correct, have been buried in place. A catastrophic global flood could never be so gentle. Thus, they reference the buried logs in Spirit Lake following the Mount St. Helens eruption and suggest that forests were sheared clear in the flood of Noah and then buried later on. This simply must be the case, as many of the fossils are cut off near their tops, as if exposed to the rough and tumble conditions of the global flood. What a damning puzzle for deep time. Would it surprise you at all if I told you that this puzzle was solved in 1868? John William Dawson described a classic Carboniferous age locality at Joggins, Nova Scotia, where there are upright giant lycopod trees up to a few meters tall, preserved mainly in river-deposited sandstones. These trees have extensive root systems with delicate rootlets that penetrate into the underlying sediment, which is either a coal seam, i.e. compressed plant material, or intensely rooted sandstone or mudstone, i.e. a soil horizon. Dawson considered and rejected anything but in situ or in-place formation for these fossils, and his interpretation is closely similar to current interpretations of sediments deposited on river floodplains today. Dawson's hunch would be shown to be correct with the documentation of stigmaria root complexes preserved with the polystrate fossils. These delicate roots, unbroken and still sprawled in ancient clay, demonstrated that these lycopod trees could not possibly have been transported elsewhere. They were preserved in place. This is already a massive problem for those flood proponents, as their oft-used example of Spirit Lake could not accommodate these observations. Fragile roots in and of themselves trounce the idea of a worldwide catastrophic flood having buried these plants, as such a powerful event would tear these minute structures to pieces. Creationists will simply disagree with the presence of these root complexes, however vast and complicated they may be. This is despite extensive documentation in places like Yellowstone. There we find upright fossil trees, except for relatively short stumps, that are rooted in place within the underlying sediments. Typically, the sediments these trees are rooted in have recognizable paleosols as well, and both the root systems and the ancient soils have been extensively documented. Worse yet for these creationists, some of the lycopods exhibit what is known as regenerative growth. Essentially, after burial, the plants managed to continue growing up and out of the sediment until they either died or were overwhelmed by subsequent local floods and accumulating sediments. These trees continued to regenerate by adding height and new roots with each increment of sediment, essentially leaving several meters of the former quote-unquote trunk buried underground as sediments accumulated. This regenerative growth is physically impossible in the context of a global flood, as plants would have been covered by miles of water even if they managed to get out of the sediment they were buried in. So how were these fossils buried in place then? Well, the conditions that lead to polystrate fossils are actually very well understood. They are formed by rare to infrequent brief episodes of rapid sedimentation separated by long periods of either slow deposition, non-deposition, or a combination of both. We see these kinds of burials today and have uncovered upright trees in places like the Mississippi River Delta, marshes, extensive floodplains, and more. Annual floods, local volcanic disasters, or even the slow incursion of a coast can and does result in polystrate fossils, the nature of which simply does not bolster creationism, but instead appears to preclude it. Creationists respond to polystrate fossils by simply doubling down that they're excellent evidence for a global flood. And they do this by ignoring the problematic aspects of these fossil phenomena. They ignore the complex, undisturbed root systems that could possibly be in place if a massive global tidal wave smacked into them, shearing them clear. They ignore the regenerative growth that could not occur if these things were covered miles deep in water. And of course, they ignore the fact that we see non-catastrophic local burials of similar structures like trees today. If confronted by a creationist on polystrate fossils, what you can do is explain the true nature of these finds using the sources in the description. Of course, this will not result in a better, more in-depth conversation about polystrate fossils, but almost certainly a pivot. But hey, at least you'll get to have yet another discussion about fossil graveyards and why they are excellent evidence for a global flood. They aren't. I made a video about it. Link in the description. So it seems indeed that polystrate fossils, or upright fossils if we're using legitimate terminology from geology, do indeed preclude young Earth creationism. Join me next time, my gentle and of course very modern apes, for another bite-sized bust to some big pseudoscience.